All right, let's talk about two words that can make anyone's head spin. Income tax. I know, it sounds super complicated. But what if I told you we could break it all down, make it totally simple right here, right now? That's exactly what we're gonna do. So, have you ever just felt completely lost? You hear income tax and you're picturing this mountain of paperwork and confusing numbers. Trust me, you are not alone. But stick with me for just the next few minutes. I promise we're gonna untangle this whole thing, starting with the absolute basics. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of how it all works, let's start with the biggest question of all. Why? Why do we even have to pay taxes? You know, it really comes down to this simple idea. Think of it like a subscription fee for living in a civilized society. That money, our tax revenue, is what the government uses to pay for everything that we all depend on. We're talking about our national defense, the roads and dams we use every day, public schools, healthcare, the whole shebang. Now, not all taxes are created equal. They basically fall into two main categories. First, you have direct tax. This is your tax, like income tax. The responsibility to pay is on you, and you can't just pass it off to someone else. Then there's indirect tax, like the GST you see on receipts. That's a tax the seller collects from you and then pays to the government. For this explainer, we're zeroing in on that first one, the direct tax on what you earn. All right, so we've got the why down, but what about the what? What are the actual rules of the game? Well, it's not just one simple rule book. It's actually a whole system of laws. And believe me, it's always changing. The best way to think about it is like a really complex board game. The main rule book? That's the Income Tax Act of 1961. But every year, the government releases an expansion pack called the Annual Finance Act, which adds new rules and tweaks the old ones. Then you've got the income tax rules. That's the detailed instruction manual for how to play your turn. And if things get confusing, the game designers release circulars and notifications, which are kind of like official FAQs. Finally, if there's ever a big argument about the rules, the ultimate decision comes from the courts. Those are the legal decisions. You need all 5 of these parts to understand the whole game. So who's the referee in this game? That's a body called the Central Board of Direct Taxes, or the CBDT. They're the ones in charge. They administer the whole system, they help frame the rules, and they make sure everyone is playing fair. Okay, let's get to the part you've been waiting for, the main event. How does all this theory and all these rules actually turn into a number, the amount of tax you have to pay? We're going to walk through it, and you'll see it's actually way more logical than it sounds. So the very first thing you have to do is sort your money. Think of it like this. You've got 5 different buckets, or what the law calls heads of income. Everything you earn, from your salary, from renting out a property, from a business, from selling investments, or even from things like bank interest, every single rupee has to go into one of these 5 buckets. That's step 1. Okay, once everything's sorted into those buckets, it's a pretty straightforward 4-step process. First, you add up the total in each of the 5 buckets. Second, you combine all of those totals into one big number. That's your gross total income. Third, and this is a big one, you get to subtract certain deductions. Think of these as little discounts the government gives you for doing things like saving or investing. And what you're left with after those deductions, that is your total taxable income. That's the magic number that your taxes actually calculated on. All right, this is where things get really interesting. Once you have that final taxable income number, you've reached a fork in the road. The tax system actually gives you a choice. There are 2 different paths you can take to calculate your final tax. And really, it all boils down to one simple trade-off. On one hand, you have the default regime. This is the newer, more streamlined system. The big plus? The tax rates are lower. The catch? You have to give up almost all of those deductions we just talked about. On the other hand, you can pick the optional regime. This is the older system. Here, the tax rates are higher, but you get to claim all those juicy deductions for your investments and expenses. So the choice is yours. Lower rates with no deductions or higher rates with deductions. And here's what that choice looks like in real numbers. Take a look. With the default regime on the left, see how the tax rates or slabs go up gradually? You don't even hit the top 30% tax bracket until your income is over 15 lakh rupees. Now glance over to the optional regime on the right. Whoa, You hit that same 30% tax rate much sooner once your income crosses 10 lakh. This is exactly why it's such a critical decision. If you have a lot of deductions you can claim, that optional path on the right might still end up saving you more money, even with the higher rates. And we're almost done, but there's one last little piece to the puzzle. It doesn't matter which path you choose, default or optional. Once you've calculated your tax, the government adds a final 4% charge on top of that amount. It's called the Health and Education Cess, and it's a non-negotiable extra bit that's specifically set aside to fund, you guessed it, health and education. And that's it. In just a few minutes, we've covered the why, the what, and the how of Indian income tax. We went from why we even pay it, to the rules of the game, all the way to that big choice you have to make. You now have the basic tools to understand how it all works. So the real question is for you. Which path makes the most sense for your money? Because picking the right one could make a huge difference.